I am Sydney, 33 years old, and on the morning of my wedding, I received a text that shattered my reality. Your brother's Dubai trip matters more than your little party. We flew out with Cameron and DeAndre last night. Sort yourself out. By dawn, my parents had abandoned me on the biggest day of my life. But when I walked down the aisle a few hours later, I was on the arm of a man I had known for exactly 3 weeks. I smiled for the cameras. By Monday, the video clip hit 1 million views, and my mother called me 61 times screaming that my father's boss had seen it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut toxic people out of your life to finally breathe. The clock on my hotel nightstand glowed a bright neon green, showing exactly 6 a.m. I was sitting on the edge of my bed in the bridal suite, staring at the screen of my phone with completely numb hands. Today was supposed to be my wedding day. Instead of bringing me breakfast and helping me into my white gown, my mother Patricia had chosen to deliver her final blow via a cowardly text message. Your brother's Dubai trip matters more than your little party. We flew out with Cameron and DeAndre last night. Sort yourself out. I read the harsh words over and over, feeling the familiar, suffocating grip of family rejection tightening in my chest. My younger brother Cameron was 29 years old and had never worked a real job in his life, yet he had always been the undisputed golden child. My parents shielded him from every consequence, while I was constantly expected to finance his repeated failures. His husband, DeAndre, was a smooth-talking crypto investor who loved to wear flashy designer brands and brag about his digital assets. DeAndre had somehow convinced my father, Gregory, that a high-profile networking trip to Dubai would secure a massive investment and make them all millions. My wedding apparently was nothing more than an acceptable casualty in their pursuit of wealth. While I was staring blankly at the wall, trying to mentally process the fact that my own parents had chosen a fraudulent business trip over walking their daughter down the aisle, my phone vibrated fiercely in my palm. A high-priority fraud alert popped up on my banking application. I opened it and saw an automated charge for $14,000 that had just been processed by an international luxury airline. My mother had used the emergency credit card I gave her last year, strictly for medical expenses, to upgrade their 4 tickets to Dubai to first class. The sheer audacity of her action instantly burned away any tears that had threatened to fall. Patricia actually thought she could humiliate me, abandon me on my wedding day, and then use my hard-earned money to sip expensive champagne somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean. I did not cry. I did not send a desperate pleading paragraph begging them to turn around. Instead, I opened my banking app, reported the massive charge as entirely fraudulent, and permanently canceled the credit card. A slow, cold smile spread across my face as I realized exactly what that cancellation meant. When their flight landed in Dubai for their layover, their connection tickets would be flagged and voided. The credit card they planned to use to check into their luxury 5-star hotel would decline, rendering it completely useless. I tapped the screen and typed a single calm reply to her cruel morning message. No worries, have a great trip. The suite door clicked open and Ethan walked in, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. Ethan was 35 years old, drove a beat-up Honda Civic with a dented bumper, and worked what my status-obsessed parents dismissively called a dead-end middle management job. They hated him from the moment they met him because he did not wear custom-tailored suits or boast loudly about his investment portfolio at the dinner table. He took one look at my face and immediately set the coffee cups down on the nearest table. I handed him the phone without saying a word. He read my mother's message, read my reply, and then pulled me into a tight, warm embrace, kissing the top of my head. They are gone, I whispered against his chest, the finality of it settling in. They really left me today. Ethan pulled back, and a sharp, cold smile started playing on his lips, matching the exact energy I was feeling. Good, he said firmly, his voice steady and completely unbothered. We do not need them here anyway. I was just talking to my uncle on the phone. He offered to walk you down the aisle if your father pulled another stunt like this. He looked me directly in the eyes. Are you ready to break the internet today? 2 hours later, I stood in the shadowed vestibule of the Grand City Cathedral, the heavy wooden doors closed securely in front of me. The majestic opening chords of the bridal march echoed loudly from the sanctuary inside, signaling that it was time. I took a deep breath and placed my hand on the arm of the man standing beside me. Winston Kensington was 65 years old, wearing an impeccably tailored black tuxedo and exuding an aura of absolute crushing authority. He was known globally as a ruthless billionaire titan of industry, a man whose mere presence in a room commanded immediate fear and unwavering respect from the most powerful politicians and CEOs in the country. My parents would have sacrificed everything they owned just to shake his hand, yet here he was standing fiercely by my side. The heavy cathedral doors swung wide open. Hundreds of seated guests turned in unison to look at the allegedly abandoned bride. As Winston Kensington escorted me down the long aisle with devastating pride and power, a smartphone camera flashed brightly from the third row, capturing a singular moment that was about to completely destroy my toxic family's entire existence. The morning sunlight hit the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Apex Holdings penthouse suite, casting sharp shadows across my custom mahogany desk. It was exactly 8 in the morning on Monday. Most newlyweds would be waking up in a luxury resort on a tropical island, enjoying their first days of marital bliss. I was sitting in my ergonomic executive chair reviewing a highly classified quarterly acquisition report. My smartphone vibrated violently against the polished wood of my desk. It had been buzzing non-stop for the better part of an hour. The high-definition screen displayed 61 missed calls. Every single one of them was from a contact saved simply as Gregory. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, savoring the bitter taste. The phone vibrated again. Call 62. I tapped the green accept button, switched the device to speakerphone, and set it down neatly next to my keyboard. What the hell did you do? The voice exploding from the tiny speaker was practically unrecognizable. It was strained, hoarse, and vibrating with absolute panic. The chaotic background noise of a crowded, echoing space filtered through the line. It sounded like the cavernous marble lobby of a luxury Dubai hotel. Good morning to you too, Dad, I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat and unaffected. How is the desert heat treating you? My father completely ignored the greeting. I could hear him hyperventilating. My boss, Warren, just locked me out of the Vanguard logistics server. My corporate email is gone. My system access is denied. My security clearance badge was deactivated while I was standing at the hotel concierge desk. Warren sent me a single text message with a link to a TikTok video of your wedding, a wedding I did not even attend. Who the hell did you marry, Sydney? I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together in my lap. I married Ethan, I said calmly. You would know that if you had bothered to show up instead of flying halfway across the world to hold your grown son's hand on a fake business trip. Do not play games with me, Gregory screamed, the sound of his fist hitting a hard surface echoing through the phone. Ethan is a nobody. He drives a rusted Honda and works in middle management. Warren recognized the man walking you down the aisle in that video. He said it was Winston Kensington. The Winston Kensington. The video has millions of views already. Financial blogs are ripping it apart. Why is a billionaire titan walking my estranged daughter down the aisle? Sydney Warren thinks I am hiding massive conflicts of interest. He thinks I am passing Vanguard trade secrets to Apex Holdings through you. He is demanding a full forensic audit of my entire division by the end of the day. That sounds like a Vanguard logistics problem, Gregory. I stated, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. Not an Apex problem. And it certainly is not my problem. You made your priorities very clear on Saturday morning. You are ruining everything, he yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. Cameron and DeAndre are meeting with a Saudi prince in exactly 2 hours. DeAndre is about to secure a $2 million investment for his new cryptocurrency exchange platform. This was our family's one shot at real generational wealth. We needed this trip to look legitimate, and your little internet stunt just put a massive target on my back. Warren is threatening to suspend me without pay and drag me in front of the board of directors. I typed a few keys on my laptop, bringing up a separate encrypted server. You mean the same crypto platform DeAndre promised would launch 3 years ago? The one you remortgaged your house twice to fund? The one that does not have a single line of viable code? DeAndre is an innovator. Gregory fired back, fiercely defending the man who was bleeding him dry. You have always been jealous of your brother's happiness. You are bitter because Cameron found a man who dreams big while you settled for mediocrity. You refused to pay for their honeymoon, so we had to. You refused to invest in his app, so I had to. And now, just when DeAndre is about to close a deal that will make us rich, you pull this manipulative stunt to steal the spotlight and sabotage your own brother. I felt a cold rush of absolute clarity. You refused to co-sign a $10,000 business loan for me 10 years ago, Dad. You looked me in the eye and said women belonged in support roles, not executive chairs. You told me my ambitions were a waste of family resources. Now you are funding a high school dropout's digital Ponzi scheme and using your employer's credibility and credit lines to do it. How dare you speak about DeAndre that way? My father was practically spitting the words. He is out there right now hustling in the VIP lounges, shaking hands with billionaires. He is building a legacy. You are just a bitter woman who had to rent a rich man to walk her down the aisle to feel important. The heavy soundproof glass door to my office swung open. Marcus, my head of cybersecurity, strode into the room. He did not knock. In my company, Marcus only bypassed my secretary when a situation was critical and required immediate action. He wore a grim, unreadable expression and carried a secure military-grade tablet in his right hand. He walked straight to my desk and placed the tablet face up right next to my phone. I glanced down at the glowing screen. Ma'am, Marcus said, his voice crisp and professional, cutting right through Gregory's frantic breathing on the speakerphone. DeAndre did not pitch any investors this morning. Our financial surveillance team just flagged a massive irregular transaction. What transaction? I asked, keeping my eyes fixed on the tablet. Gregory went dead silent on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of elevator chimes in his hotel lobby. Marcus tapped the screen once, bringing up a high-resolution photograph taken from a live security feed. It showed DeAndre sitting at a green felt card table, wearing a garish designer shirt, a mountain of plastic chips pushed carelessly toward the dealer. He just swiped Gregory's corporate card for $50,000 at the Atlantis Fahiv IP blackjack table, Marcus stated loudly and clearly. The transaction was flagged by our automated systems because the card is directly tied to the Vanguard Logistics corporate expense account. I looked at the transaction timestamp. It was processed exactly 4 minutes ago. My father had just unknowingly bankrolled a gambling spree with stolen company money right as his boss initiated a forensic audit. I leaned forward, bringing my face closer to the phone's microphone. I let a slow, sharp smile spread across my face, feeling the absolute power of the moment. "Did you hear that, Dad?" I asked, my tone dripping with absolute ice. There was nothing but the sound of ragged, terrified breathing coming from the Dubai hotel lobby. The bravado and the screaming were entirely gone, replaced by the suffocating realization of his own destruction. "Enjoy Dubai, Dad," I said. "It is about to get very hot." 3 days later, the heat finally reached New York. Sydney sat at the small, scarred kitchen island of the modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens she shared with Ethan. They kept this place specifically to maintain their cover. To her family, Sydney was just a struggling, independent financial advisor, and Ethan was stuck in corporate middle management. The apartment with its chipped laminate countertops and rattling radiator sold the lie perfectly. Ethan poured 2 mugs of cheap drip coffee, wearing a faded gray t-shirt. They were enjoying the quiet morning when the front door burst open with enough force to crack the drywall behind it. Patricia marched in first, dragging a massive designer suitcase. Gregory followed, his face pale and slick with sweat, his tie hanging loosely around his neck. Cameron and DeAndre brought up the rear. The 4 of them looked thoroughly jet-lagged, entirely manic, and absolutely furious. Patricia did not offer a greeting. She did not offer an apology for abandoning her only daughter on her wedding day. She dropped her suitcase onto the scuffed hardwood floor and pointed a shaking finger directly at Sydney. Call him right now. Patricia screamed, her voice echoing off the thin apartment walls. Call that old man who walked you down the aisle. Tell him to talk to Warren immediately. Your father is suspended pending a federal audit and you are going to fix it. Sydney took a slow sip of her coffee, letting the silence stretch. She looked at her father. Gregory refused to meet her eyes, staring instead at the cheap linoleum floor. You abandoned me at the altar so you could fly to Dubai? Sydney said, keeping her voice dangerously level. And your first words to me are a demand for a favor. Patricia slammed her hands down on the kitchen island. Do not play the victim. You clearly manipulated that poor billionaire into feeling sorry for you. I do not care what kind of sugar daddy arrangement you have with Winston Kensington. You will use it to save this family. Warren suspended your father without pay, locked him out of his pension, and froze his corporate accounts. You need to call Winston and force him to call Vanguard Logistics. Cameron pushed his way forward, rolling his eyes dramatically. Honestly, Sydney, you are being completely selfish. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to be turned away at the Dubai airport? Our connection tickets were flagged as fraudulent. We had to sit in economy for 14 hours on the flight back. DeAndre was practically hyperventilating. DeAndre stepped up beside his husband. He shot Ethan a look of pure disgust before turning his attention to Sydney. He aggressively adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, making sure the heavy diamond-encrusted designer watch on his wrist caught the morning light. Let us be real here, DeAndre scoffed, crossing his arms. You got incredibly lucky, Sydney. You somehow managed to land a rich guy's nephew. We all know Ethan does not have any actual power, but his uncle clearly does. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to have Winston fund my crypto platform. I need $2 million in seed capital by Friday. Once my exchange goes live, I will bail your dad out of this mess myself. Ethan took a slow sip of his coffee, leaning back against the kitchen counter with an expression of mild amusement. He did not say a word. He just watched Sydney work. DeAndre leaned over the counter, invading Sydney's personal space. Do not be greedy like you were last year. You refused to pay for our honeymoon in Paris and Cameron cried for a week. You owe this family. We are on the verge of generational wealth and your little internet wedding stunt is ruining our timeline. Get me the $2 million and I will fix your father's career. Gregory finally looked up, his eyes wide and frantic. Just do it, Sydney. DeAndre is a visionary. He has investors lined up around the block. If you just get us the bridge loan from Winston, everything goes back to normal. Sydney did not yell. She did not defend Ethan. She did not justify her marriage. She simply reached out and placed her hands on her open laptop. The screen was facing her, hiding the display from her family. She tapped the spacebar to wake it up, clicked open a highly classified financial dossier, and maximized the images attached to the file. You have investors lined up around the block, DeAndre Sydney asked, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. Of course I do, DeAndre snapped, puffing out his chest. I am a highly respected digital asset manager. Sydney calmly turned the laptop around, sliding it across the chipped counter so it sat directly in front of DeAndre and Gregory. Displayed on the bright screen were 4 high-resolution security photographs. They were crystal clear, time-stamped, and undeniably real. They showed DeAndre sitting at a VIP blackjack table inside the Atlantis Casino in Dubai. He was laughing, holding a glass of whiskey and pushing a massive mountain of plastic chips toward the dealer. Right next to the photos was a digitized copy of a receipt. The receipt showed a direct charge to Gregory's Vanguard Logistics corporate expense card. The room went dead silent, the kind of silence that happens right before a bomb detonates. Cameron let out a confused gasp. Gregory stumbled backward, his face draining of whatever color was left. He stared at the screen, then turned his horrified gaze toward his son-in-law. Sydney folded her hands under her chin and offered DeAndre a razor-sharp smile. Are you going to bail him out with the $50,000 you lost at the blackjack table, DeAndre? The silence in the kitchen lasted exactly 3 seconds before Gregory snapped. He lunged across the scuffed linoleum, his hands grabbing the collar of DeAndre's flashy designer shirt. The coffee mugs on the counter rattled as Gregory slammed his son-in-law against the cabinets. He screamed that his career was over, that Warren was going to have him arrested for corporate embezzlement. DeAndre scrambled backward, knocking a decorative fruit bowl to the floor, where it shattered into dozens of pieces. He threw his hands up, shouting defensively that the casino was just an elite networking venue, a necessary place to find real capital for his startup. Cameron threw himself between the two men, pushing his father away with a hysterical shriek. He stood in front of DeAndre like a human shield, his face blotchy and red. Cameron pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice pitching into a shrill wail. He accused me of fabricating the entire thing. He screamed that I was so deeply jealous of his perfect marriage and his husband's brilliant entrepreneurial mind that I had hired someone to Photoshop those casino images just to ruin their moment of triumph. "You have always tried to destroy me," Cameron sobbed, clutching DeAndre's arm tightly. "You were jealous when Mom and Dad paid for my college tuition while you had to work night shifts. You were jealous when they threw us a massive engagement party while you had a pathetic little ceremony. Now you are faking financial records to frame DeAndre because you cannot stand seeing us succeed." I did not move an inch. I simply watched my 29-year-old brother throw a toddler-level tantrum in my kitchen. "You actually think I possess the free time to forge casino surveillance footage from the United Arab Emirates?" I asked flatly. "Your husband is a con artist, Cameron. He used Dad's corporate credit line to play high-stakes blackjack. There were no Saudi princes, there were no foreign investors. There was just DeAndre, a tray of complimentary drinks, and $50,000 of Vanguard Logistics money disappearing into the dealer's Dropbox." Patricia stepped forward. Her hand came down hard on my laptop keyboard, violently slamming the screen shut. The sharp crack echoed in the small room, instantly silencing Gregory and Cameron. My mother glared at me, her eyes burning with the exact same toxic rage I had endured my entire childhood. "How dare you spy on your own family?" Patricia snarled, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "DeAndre is a visionary entrepreneur. He has legitimate networking expenses. You have absolutely no right to monitor his movements or hack into international casino databases." I looked at her, genuinely amazed by her staggering capacity for denial. "He committed corporate fraud, Mom. He stole from Dad's employer." Patricia waved her hand in the air, dismissing the federal crime as if it were a minor social misstep. It was a temporary bridge loan, she demanded fiercely. He was going to put the money back as soon as his crypto platform launched. "You are the one making this a crisis. Since you have clearly been stalking him, you know exactly how much he spent. You need to wire $50,000 into your father's Vanguard account right now. You need to pay off that balance before Warren's internal auditors find the discrepancy." Gregory eagerly latched onto this delusion. "Yes," he gasped, frantically smoothing his wrinkled tie. "Yes, Sydney. If you clear the balance today, Warren will not have any grounds to terminate me. I can say it was an accounting error. You have to fix this. It is your absolute duty to this family." I reached out and slowly pushed my closed laptop aside. I opened the top drawer of the kitchen island, retrieved a thick manila envelope, and pulled out a certified financial ledger bearing a gold-embossed corporate seal. I slid the heavy stack of paper across the counter until it rested directly in front of my mother. "I am not going to wire Vanguard a single dime," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "And I did not spy on anyone. Vanguard already knows about the missing funds. Warren initiated the audit because the fraud department at their issuing bank flagged the transaction the moment it hit the ledger." Patricia scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Then call the bank and pay it off. Use whatever sugar daddy money Winston Kensington gave you for walking you down the aisle." I tapped my manicured fingernail against the gold seal on the document. "I do not need to call the bank, Mom. The corporate card Vanguard Logistics uses is underwritten by a financial subsidiary of Apex Holdings. When a massive high-risk fraudulent charge is flagged at an overseas casino, my automated risk management protocols freeze the asset." I reviewed the alert myself this morning. Gregory stared at the document, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. "You called my wedding a little party," I continued, leaning forward to ensure every word landed like a physical blow. "You abandoned me on the most important day of my life to fund a scam. So instead of using my personal wealth to pay for a honeymoon you felt entitled to, I used it to acquire the bad debt from the subsidiary. I bought the $50,000 liability outright. The money you stole from Vanguard Logistics now belongs to my private portfolio. DeAndre stared at me, the arrogant smirk finally melting off his face entirely. What are you talking about? He stammered, stepping away from Cameron. I am talking about the law, I replied smoothly. You do not owe Vanguard Logistics anymore, DeAndre. I am your legally documented creditor. You owe me $50,000 payable immediately with a massive daily interest rate. If you default by the end of the business day, I will personally hand the transaction records to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Patricia let out a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated fury. She lunged forward, her hand raising high in the air, aiming a vicious slap directly at my face. She intended to strike me down, to physically punish me for daring to hold her golden family accountable. Before her hand could even cross the kitchen counter, Ethan moved. He did not just block her. He caught her wrist mid-air with terrifying speed and precision. His grip was like a steel vise, stopping her hand mere inches from my cheek. Patricia gasped in pain, her eyes wide with shock as she looked at the man she had always dismissed as a weak middle management nobody. Ethan did not raise his voice. He leaned in his face inches from my mother's, and his voice dropped to a lethal, ice-cold whisper. If you touch my wife, your husband will not just lose his job. I will make sure he loses his freedom. Patricia gasped a sharp, ragged sound that seemed to suck all the air out of our cramped kitchen. She violently yanked her hand back, stumbling into Cameron, who had to grab the edge of the chipped counter to keep them both from falling. She cradled her wrist against her chest, her eyes wide with a mixture of physical shock and profound disbelief. She stared at Ethan as if he had just materialized from thin air. This was the man she had mocked for driving a beat-up Honda, the man she had dismissed as an unambitious nobody. Now his grip had left red marks on her skin, and the absolute authority in his voice had frozen her in place. Gregory, however, was experiencing a completely different kind of revelation. The panic that had been driving him suddenly morphed into a sickening, desperate kind of calculation. He looked at Ethan, truly looked at him for the first time, and connected the dots. Ethan was not just my husband. He was the nephew of Winston Kensington, the billionaire whose mere shadow could dictate the fate of a multinational corporation like Vanguard Logistics. Gregory physically pushed past DeAndre, ignoring the man he had just been defending, and closed the distance between himself and Ethan. His entire posture shifted from aggressive to pathetic. He literally bowed his shoulders, his hands held out in a placating, desperate gesture. "Ethan, please," Gregory stammered, his voice dropping an octave, trying to manufacture a tone of camaraderie that had never existed. "Let us just take a breath. We are all family here. Emotions are running high. I know Patricia was out of line, but you have to understand the pressure I am under. Warren is out for blood. But Winston listens to you. You are his blood. Just make one phone call, one 5-minute conversation with your uncle to vouch for my character. Tell him the casino charge was an unauthorized error by a subordinate. Tell him Vanguard cannot afford to lose my divisional expertise." I watched my father, a man who had spent my entire life demanding absolute submission and projecting unwavering authority, literally begging in my cheap kitchen. He was sweating through his tailored suit, his pride completely discarded in the face of financial ruin. Ethan did not blink. He slowly reached over, picked up his coffee mug, and took a casual sip. He looked down at Gregory with the kind of clinical detachment a scientist might reserve for a particularly uninteresting insect. "I do not mix family with business, Gregory," Ethan said, his voice smooth and entirely devoid of sympathy. "And I certainly do not leverage my uncle's global influence to cover up federal embezzlement committed by a middle manager who lacks basic institutional control." Gregory opened his mouth to protest, but Ethan held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. "You allowed an unauthorized civilian to access a Vanguard Logistics corporate line of credit to fund a gambling spree in a foreign jurisdiction." Ethan continued, laying out the facts with devastating precision. "That is a massive security breach. My uncle did not build a multi-billion-dollar empire by bailing out incompetent executives. Your fate is entirely in Warren's hands now. If I were you, I would spend less time begging me for favors and more time looking for a very good white-collar defense attorney. The absolute finality of Ethan's rejection hit Gregory like a physical blow. He staggered back, his face turning an ashen gray. He had played his last card, and it had crumbled into dust. Patricia, nursing her bruised wrist and her infinitely more bruised ego, stepped forward. The shock had worn off, replaced entirely by the venomous, vindictive rage she always fell back on when she lost control. If begging would not work, she would resort to destruction. "Fine," Patricia spat, her voice trembling with malice as she glared at me. "You want to play hardball, Sydney? You want to pretend you hold all the cards just because you tricked some rich heir into marrying you? We will see how long that lasts." She grabbed her designer purse from the island, her knuckles white. "Vanguard Logistics is hosting their annual charity gala tomorrow night at the plaza," Patricia announced, a cruel, triumphant smile stretching across her face. "Warren will be there. The board of directors will be there. And I know for a fact Winston Kensington is the guest of honor. Since you are so determined to ruin this family, I am going to return the favor." Cameron and DeAndre exchanged a look, suddenly emboldened by my mother's shift in tactics. "I am going to march right up to Warren and Winston tomorrow night," Patricia continued, her volume rising with every word. "I will tell them exactly who you are, Sydney. I will tell Winston that you are a manipulative, lying gold digger who used his nephew to access his wealth. I will tell Warren that you fabricated those casino documents to frame your own father out of petty jealousy. I will make a scene so massive and so public that the Kensington family will annul this farce of a marriage by the weekend to save their own reputation. You will not have a marriage, a rich uncle, or a dime to your name by midnight." She turned on her heel, kicking her massive suitcase toward the door. "Come on, Gregory. We are leaving. We have a gala to prepare for." Cameron shot me one last look of absolute disgust. "You are dead to us, Sydney," he sneered, grabbing DeAndre's arm and following my parents out the door. The heavy apartment door slammed shut with a deafening crack, rattling the cheap picture frames on the walls. The sudden silence in the kitchen was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the ancient refrigerator. Ethan let out a low, amused breath. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms and looking at me with a raised eyebrow. "Are they really going to crash the Vanguard Gala?" Ethan asked, a genuine smile playing on his lips. "Are they really going to throw a tantrum in front of my uncle and the board of directors?" I did not answer immediately. I walked over to the kitchen island, picked up my smartphone, and opened my encrypted executive communication portal. I bypassed the standard security protocols and accessed the event management manifest for the Vanguard Charity Gala. "Let them," I said, my voice cold and focused, as my fingers flew across the digital keyboard. "I just authorized their names at the security checkpoint. They have VIP access and front row seats directly facing the main podium." I locked the screen and looked up at Ethan, matching his smile with one of my own. "I want them front and center." The morning of the Vanguard Logistics Charity Gala arrived with a suffocating humidity that matched the tension gripping Manhattan. By 2 in the afternoon, I was standing on a velvet pedestal inside the VIP salon of Maison Genevieve, the most exclusive evening wear atelier on Fifth Avenue. The air smelled of white lilies and chilled champagne. My seamstress was meticulously pinning the hem of a custom midnight blue silk gown that draped down my back like liquid glass. Ethan was securing our transportation logistics from his corporate office, leaving me to enjoy a rare moment of quiet preparation. That quiet shattered the moment the polished brass doors of the salon swung open. I did not need to see them to know who had just invaded the sanctuary. The sharp, demanding click of my mother's heels on the marble floor was unmistakable, followed immediately by Cameron's loud, complaining voice. They were frantically hunting for last-minute gala attire, desperately trying to project an image of untouchable wealth to save Gregory's crumbling career. I stood perfectly still behind the heavy velvet curtain of my fitting room, listening as they bullied an entry-level sales associate. Patricia demanded to see the latest couture collection, dropping Gregory's newly issued emergency credit card onto a glass display case with a loud thud. Then the entire salon went dead silent. Patricia had spotted my signature leather handbag sitting on one of the plush viewing sofas. I heard her sharp intake of breath. She marched directly over to Genevieve, the boutique's formidable owner, who was managing the main floor. "Listen to me very carefully," Patricia ordered, dropping her voice into a conspiratorial, venomous hiss that carried easily through the silk curtains. "The woman in that fitting room is my daughter Sydney. She is a compulsive liar and a complete fraud. She is currently staging a massive hoax to embarrass our family, and I can guarantee you that whatever credit card she gave you is going to decline." Genevieve did not say a word. I could practically feel the store owner's icy glare penetrating the fabric barrier. Patricia misread the silence as hesitation. She reached into her designer bag, pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills she had likely drained from a cash advance, and slammed it onto the glass counter right next to her credit card. "Take this," Patricia commanded. "Go back there and halt those alterations immediately. Snip a seam in the bodice, ruin the zipper. Spill a glass of champagne on the silk. I do not care how you do it, but you must ensure she cannot wear that gown tonight. She is trying to crash a highly exclusive corporate event to ruin my husband, and I will not allow her to walk into the Plaza Hotel looking like royalty." Cameron scoffed loudly, leaning against a display case of diamond accessories. "She has always been incredibly cheap," he sneered, his voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Do not trust a single word she says about her finances. Remember when she wore that hideous moth-eaten thrift store dress to my college graduation? She humiliated our entire family in front of my fraternity brothers. She is probably trying to steal whatever dress you put her in right now." I stood in front of the trifold mirror, looking at my reflection. My expression was perfectly calm, but my hands slowly balled into tight fists at my sides. Cameron's graduation. I remembered that day vividly. I remembered the cheap, scratchy fabric of that second-hand dress scraping against my skin in the sweltering heat of the stadium. I wore that thrift store dress because I had literally drained my savings account to zero. I had spent 8 months working my intense corporate job during the day and waiting tables at a diner until 2 in the morning. I took every single dollar from those exhausting night shifts and secretly paid off Cameron's final tuition installment. Gregory had gambled away the remaining college fund on a catastrophic day trade, and Cameron would have been barred from receiving his diploma. I sacrificed my sleep, my health, and my pride so my brother could walk across that stage. And this was how he remembered it. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the anger crystallize into absolute focus. I did not raise my voice. I did not push the curtain aside to defend my honor or list my sacrifices. I just waited. Outside the fitting room, the silence stretched until it became agonizing. Patricia tapped her foot impatiently against the marble. "Well," she snapped, "take the money and ruin the dress. I am giving you a direct order." Genevieve finally moved. She did not reach for the cash. Instead, she reached out with one manicured finger and slowly pushed the stack of bills right back to the edge of the glass counter, letting it spill onto the floor. Madame Genevieve said, her thick French accent laced with an elite, crushing disdain that no amount of money could buy. "I strongly suggest you pick up your trash and exit my establishment before I have my security team physically throw you onto Fifth Avenue." Patricia gasped in outrage. "Do you know who I am? My husband is a senior executive at Vanguard Logistics. I do not care if your husband is the President of the United States," Genevieve countered, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "You have walked into my gallery and demanded I sabotage my most important client. You clearly have no idea who you are dealing with. Madam Mrs. Kensington owns the building this boutique leases. Her account is infinite." The color instantly drained from Patricia's face. I could hear Cameron let out a strangled, pathetic squeak as the reality of the boutique manager's words hit them like a freight train. Mrs. Kensington. The name hung in the air, heavy and lethal. I reached out and smoothly pulled the velvet curtain back. I stepped out of the fitting room, the heavy midnight blue silk of the gown cascading flawlessly around my figure. The diamonds at my throat caught the ambient light, throwing sharp reflections across the room. I looked directly at my mother. Her jaw was literally hanging open. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it looked as though she had seen a ghost. Her hand hovered in the air, still reaching for the scattered cash on the floor. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers and gold leaf molding. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their classical arrangements entirely drowned out by the clinking of champagne flutes and the low, steady hum of corporate networking. Vanguard Logistics spared absolutely no expense for their annual charity gala. It was a night explicitly designed to impress major shareholders, intimidate global competitors, and cement the executive board's social dominance in Manhattan. Through the massive gilded doors walked my family, radiating a desperate, frantic energy that clashed violently with the room's refined old money atmosphere. Patricia led the charge, her chin tilted upward in an arrogant, overcompensating sneer. After being unceremoniously threatened with security at Maison Genevieve, she had clearly scrambled to find a replacement gown at the last possible minute. She wore a heavily sequined ruby-red dress that looked distinctly off the rack. The fabric was stiff, the cut was dated, and the sequins caught the light in a cheap, glaring way that drew all the wrong kinds of attention. Beside her, Gregory adjusted the collar of a rented tuxedo that was visibly too tight around his shoulders. His face was slick with a layer of nervous sweat, his forced smile looking more like a grimace. Cameron and DeAndre flanked them both wearing velvet dinner jackets in loud jewel tones that screamed newly acquired debt. They strutted into the ballroom as if they were the guests of honor, completely oblivious to the polite, confused stares of the seasoned executives they aggressively bumped past. DeAndre did not waste a single second taking in the ambiance. He immediately zeroed in on a group of older men wearing platinum luxury watches and bespoke suits. He slid smoothly into their circle, interrupting their quiet conversation to flash his perfectly bleached teeth. I watched from across the room as he began aggressively handing out thick, glossy business cards featuring an embossed cryptocurrency logo. He spoke loudly about disruptive blockchain paradigms, decentralized asset management, and guaranteed triple-digit returns. He was aggressively cornering men who had spent their entire lives dealing in tangible freight and global shipping lines. The investors stared at his fake business cards with barely concealed disdain, exchanging highly uncomfortable glances before slowly inching away from his frantic pitch. While DeAndre played the part of a Silicon Valley prodigy, Gregory was engaged in a completely different kind of hustle. His eyes darted frantically across the sea of guests, scanning every passing face. He was hunting for Warren. The clock was ticking louder in his head than the string quartet in the corner. If Gregory could just find his boss, corner him near the bar, and ply him with a few expensive drinks, he might be able to spin a fabricated, convoluted excuse for the missing $50,000. He needed to secure his narrative before the internal audit finalized on Monday morning. He grabbed a glass of whiskey from a passing waiter, downing half of it in a single desperate gulp, his panicked gaze snapping from one VIP table to the next. Ethan handed me a crystal flute of sparkling water, breaking my observation of the impending train wreck. We were standing near the carved mahogany bar at the far edge of the room, deliberately keeping our distance from the main floor. The midnight blue silk of my custom gown moved like liquid glass as I turned to face my husband. The alterations were absolutely flawless. Genevieve had personally ensured the dress fit like a second skin, the fabric perfectly tailored to every contour without a single stitch out of place. Ethan looked devastatingly sharp in a midnight black tuxedo, his posture relaxed, his dark eyes taking in the room with the quiet absolute authority of a man who owned the very ground we stood on. We were not there to mingle. We were not there to network. We were there to watch the house of cards collapse. It took exactly 12 minutes for Patricia to spot me. I saw the exact second her eyes locked onto the blue silk gown. Her entire body stiffened as if she had touched a live wire. The color completely drained from her face, replaced instantly by a mottled, angry red. She recognized the dress. She recognized the diamonds resting at my throat. And she recognized that despite her aggressive bribing attempts to sabotage me, I had walked into the most exclusive event of the corporate season looking utterly untouchable. Patricia did not approach me immediately. She was far too calculated for a direct, isolated assault. Instead, she turned her back to me and began scanning the room for collateral damage. She quickly identified a cluster of older, highly manicured women standing near a towering ice sculpture. They were the wives of Vanguard's senior vice president's women whose entire social currency relied on vicious gossip and strict corporate hierarchy. Patricia smoothed the stiff fabric of her sequined dress plastered on a tragically brave, victimized smile and inserted herself directly into their circle. I watched her lean in and whisper something to the woman closest to her. The woman gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace in exaggerated shock. The other wives leaned in closer, their eyes darting eagerly past Patricia's shoulder toward my position at the bar. Patricia was weaving a masterful narrative, casting herself as the heartbroken, long-suffering mother and me as the ultimate scandal of the evening. With her captive audience thoroughly primed and outraged, Patricia led the charge. The flock of socialites followed closely behind her, their champagne glasses held like weapons, their faces masks of righteous indignation. They crossed the ballroom floor like a predatory strike team, parting the dense crowd with their aggressive momentum. Ethan shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing warmly against mine, a silent physical reminder that he was an immovable wall right beside me. I took a slow, measured sip of my water, my expression remaining entirely neutral and detached, as my mother came to an abrupt halt 2 feet away from me. The socialite wives fanned out behind Patricia, staring at me with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. Patricia looked me up and down, her eyes burning with a toxic mixture of deep-seated jealousy and pure, unadulterated hatred. She did not lower her voice for privacy. In fact, she projected her words perfectly to ensure that everyone within a 20-foot radius could hear exactly what she was about to say. "Watch your husbands, ladies," Patricia announced to the crowded room, her voice carrying clearly and sharply over the classical music. She gestured toward me with a dramatic, disgusted sweep of her hand, her lip curling into a sneer. "My daughter here has absolutely no real career and no morals. She just manipulates wealthy, unsuspecting older men into walking her down the aisle because her own family knows exactly how toxic and deceitful she truly is." The sharp, ringing silence that followed Patricia's venomous declaration was quickly filled by the collective synchronized gasps of the Vanguard logistics wives. They immediately huddled closer together, forming a barricade of expensive perfume and judgmental glares. Their eyes raked over my midnight blue silk gown, dissecting me, actively searching for the invisible flaws Patricia had just loudly announced to the room. A few of them hid cruel, knowing smirks behind their crystal champagne flutes, murmuring to one another in hushed, delighted tones. Patricia had served them fresh scandal on a silver platter, and they were eager to feast. Ethan's phone vibrated aggressively against the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled it out, glanced briefly at the illuminated screen, and then looked down at me. A subtle, dangerous smirk touched the corner of his mouth. He knew exactly what was about to happen. He knew he did not need to protect me from these women. "I need to take this," Ethan murmured, his rich voice carrying just enough for the front row of gossiping wives to hear. "Excuse me, ladies." He turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing seamlessly into the dense sea of black tie executives without a backward glance. Patricia's triumphant smile practically split her face in two. She thought Ethan was fleeing the embarrassment. She thought he had finally realized the truth of her vicious words and was abandoning me to the wolves. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, the stiff fabric of her cheap sequined dress catching the harsh ballroom lights. She stood tall, waiting for me to crumble under the collective weight of high society judgment, waiting for me to run out of the Plaza Hotel in tears. I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze. I simply took a slow, measured sip of my sparkling water and turned my attention away from my mother entirely. I focused my gaze on the woman standing directly to Patricia's right. She was the undisputed alpha of this particular pack of socialites. She wore a vintage Cartier diamond necklace and possessed the kind of severe, perfectly lifted features that screamed old Manhattan money. This was Beatrice Sterling, wife of Arthur Sterling, the chief executive officer of Sterling Global Banking. Vanguard Logistics relied heavily on Arthur's bank for their primary international credit lines, making Beatrice a woman Patricia desperately wanted to impress. Beatrice, I said smoothly, my voice cutting through the snickering like a polished blade. That is a stunning Cartier piece. It pairs beautifully with the aggressive restructuring Arthur is planning for the third quarter. The snickering stopped instantly. Beatrice blinked, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in sudden sharp confusion. I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about, Beatrice replied, her tone dripping with practiced condescension. Arthur is not restructuring anything. Of course he is, I countered, keeping my tone conversational and light as if we were discussing the weather. The Sterling Meridian merger. It has been kept remarkably quiet. Arthur is planning to liquidate the entire commercial lending division to absorb Meridian's offshore assets. It is a brilliant strategy, really. It completely bypasses the federal regulatory hold that has been blocking Sterling Global for the last 18 months. Beatrice went entirely rigid. The color began to drain rapidly from her perfectly powdered face. This was not public knowledge. It was highly classified Tier 1 boardroom strategy that had not even been briefed to the bank's senior vice presidents. It was information that could trigger a federal investigation if leaked prematurely. Patricia let out a loud mocking laugh, completely oblivious to the sudden paralyzing terror radiating from the banking CEO's wife standing right beside her. "Oh, please," Patricia scoffed, rolling her eyes and waving her hand in my face as if swatting away a fly. "Stop reading finance blogs, Sydney. It is embarrassing. You are trying to sound intelligent in front of these women, but we all know the truth. You could not even pass entry-level accounting in college. You literally had to drop out of your business seminar to work double shifts at a greasy diner just to pay your rent. Do not stand here and pretend you know the first thing about corporate mergers or international banking." I looked at Patricia, feeling a fleeting moment of genuine pity for her absolute blinding ignorance. She still saw me as the exhausted 20-year-old girl scrubbing tables until 2 in the morning to secretly pay off Cameron's tuition. She was utterly blind to the decade of ruthless corporate warfare I had waged to build my own empire from the ground up. I turned my eyes back to Beatrice, completely ignoring my mother's pathetic outburst. Arthur is heavily relying on a silent third-party acquisition firm to facilitate the initial stock buyout. I continued, stepping slightly closer to the trembling socialite. A firm that specializes in acquiring distressed logistics debt and leveraging it for hostile takeovers. He needed a phantom buyer to purchase the initial 51% of Delta Corp before the federal regulators caught wind of the impending monopoly. Beatrice's hand began to shake. The crystal stem of her champagne flute trembled violently against her heavy diamond rings. She looked at me not with judgment, but with rising, suffocating panic. "He told me the phantom buyer was a private equity ghost," Beatrice stammered, all her haughty arrogance entirely erased. Her voice was barely a whisper, now panicked and desperate. "He said no one knew who held the controlling shares. He said the proxy firm was an impenetrable fortress and completely untraceable." "It is impenetrable," I agreed, offering her a polite, devastating smile. "Because I designed the security protocols myself." The crystal champagne flute slipped from Beatrice's trembling fingers. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into dozens of glittering pieces. The expensive vintage splashed across the hem of her designer gown and splattered violently onto Patricia's cheap red sequins. None of the women moved. They stared at the broken glass, and then they slowly turned their terrified eyes toward me. The air in our small circle had grown freezing cold. Beatrice looked at me, her eyes wide with a terror that perfectly mirrored what Patricia had felt in the boutique hours earlier. Her mouth opened and closed twice before she could force the words out. "You," Beatrice gasped, her voice completely devoid of breath. "You are the phantom buyer, the one who orchestrated the hostile takeover of Delta Corp." I took another slow, deliberate sip of my water, my eyes locking onto hers with absolute, unwavering authority. "Guilty." The shattered crystal of Beatrice's champagne flute still lay glittering across the polished marble floor. The collective breath of Manhattan's most vicious socialites hitched in their throats. Beatrice Sterling, a woman who usually dictated the financial caste system of the Upper East Side, with a single glance looked completely broken. She was staring at me with the terrified realization that she had just openly insulted the very person holding the absolute fate of her husband's banking empire. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch, letting the absolute terror sink into their meticulously contoured faces. Patricia was paralyzed beside them, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as her brain short-circuited. She had brought these women here to destroy me, and instead, I had just casually dismantled the most powerful woman in the room. Before Beatrice could force another word past her trembling lips, a heavy, violently aggressive force shoved through the tight circle of women. Gregory practically bulldozed a senior vice president's wife out of the way, his face glistening with a thick layer of panicked sweat. His rented tuxedo jacket was wrinkled, his tie slightly askew, and his eyes were wide with a frantic, animalistic desperation. He did not notice the spilled champagne. He did not notice the absolute shock radiating from the Vanguard wives. He did not even notice his own wife standing frozen in horror. His large, clammy hand clamped down hard on my bicep. His fingers dug viciously into the delicate midnight blue silk of my custom gown, his grip entirely too tight, dragging me a half step forward. "Stop playing dress-up and call Ethan right now!" Gregory hissed his voice, a frantic, breathless command that completely shattered the refined ambiance of the ballroom. "I have been looking everywhere for Warren, and he is avoiding me. You need to get your husband over here immediately. I need Ethan to introduce me to Winston before Warren officially fires me. I need Winston to vouch for me tonight." He tried to pull me toward the center of the room, treating me exactly as he always had. Like a disposable pawn, a mindless extension of his own ambition. He expected me to blindly follow his orders, to scramble to fix his catastrophic mistakes, just to earn a crumb of his conditional approval. I did not move. I planted my heels into the marble floor and violently ripped my arm out of his grasp. The sudden aggressive motion forced Gregory to stumble backward. He looked at me in absolute shock, clearly entirely unprepared for any physical or verbal resistance. "Do not ever put your hands on me again," I stated, my voice dangerously low, ringing with an icy authority that made the surrounding socialites instinctively step back. Gregory's face flushed a deep, furious crimson. "How dare you speak to me that way?" he snarled, taking another aggressive step forward. "You are my daughter. You will do exactly as I say. Get Ethan over here right now and fix this." I smoothed the wrinkled silk on my sleeve, my eyes locking onto his with absolute, unfiltered disgust. "I cannot fix federal fraud, Dad," I replied, my voice carrying cleanly over the quieted crowd. "And a polite handshake from Winston Kensington is not going to save you from a prison sentence." Gregory blinked, a flash of genuine confusion crossing his features before the denial set back in. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, frantically waving his hand. "The casino charges were just a misunderstanding. I can explain the $50,000 to Warren. It was a simple corporate oversight." I let out a harsh, humorless laugh. It was not a laugh of amusement, but of profound disbelief at his staggering capacity for self-deception. "We are way past the casino charges, Gregory," I said smoothly, stepping into his personal space, forcing him to look me dead in the eye. "Vanguard Logistics initiated a full forensic audit of your entire division yesterday morning. They did not just find the $50,000 DeAndre blew at the blackjack tables. They found the real hemorrhage. You stole $2 million from your own company's employee pension fund to finance DeAndre's completely fraudulent crypto scam." The Vanguard wives gasped collectively, a loud, dramatic intake of air that rippled through the gathering crowd. The word pension hung in the air like a live grenade. Gregory's face went completely ashen, the blood draining from his cheeks so fast he looked physically ill. But the panic quickly twisted into a toxic defensive rage. He threw his hands up in the air, his voice escalating into a booming, furious shout that caused conversations across the entire ballroom to grind to an abrupt halt. "It was not a theft," Gregory bellowed, completely abandoning any pretense of keeping a low profile. The string quartet in the corner faltered, their bows slowing as the room turned its collective attention toward us. It was a temporary liquidity bridge. DeAndre needed initial capital to launch his decentralized platform. Cameron and DeAndre are visionaries. They are building the future of digital finance. I was going to replace every single dime of that pension fund the moment the platform went public. It is called taking a calculated business risk. You funneled retirement savings into a phantom shell company. I countered, my tone flat and unyielding against his rising hysteria. There is no platform. There is no product. There is just your son and his husband burning through stolen millions to fund a lavish lifestyle you enabled. You know nothing about real business. Gregory screamed, his face contorted with the exact same aggressive entitlement that had suffocated my entire childhood. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. You are just a bitter, jealous girl who cannot stand to see her brother succeed. I am on the verge of securing generational wealth for this family, and you are trying to tear it down. He stepped aggressively forward, his chest heaving, his voice echoing off the gold leaf ceilings. I am your father, Gregory commanded, his voice dripping with venom. You owe this family. You will find Ethan, you will bring Winston Kensington to me, and you will force them to bail out my division. It is your absolute duty as a daughter to clean up this mess. Do it now! He reached out to grab me again, his large hand flying toward my shoulder. Before his fingers could even graze the silk of my gown, a booming, furious voice cut through the dead, silent ballroom like a thunderclap. Take your hands off her, Gregory. The crowd parted instantly, practically shoving each other out of the way. Warren, the chief executive officer of Vanguard Logistics, strode through the clearing. His face was a mask of absolute, unadulterated fury, and he was flanked by 3 massive, stone-faced private security guards. The heavy, punishing hand that had been gripping my arm just a second ago instantly went completely slack. Gregory dropped his arm to his side as if the limb had suddenly been severed from his body. I watched a miraculous, pathetic transformation take place in the span of a single heartbeat. The aggressive, red-faced tyrant who had terrorized our household with his booming voice and physical intimidation for decades completely vanished. In his place stood a sniveling, sweating, terrified middle manager. Gregory hunched his broad shoulders, actively shrinking his physical presence as he pivoted to face the man who controlled his entire livelihood. Warren, Sir Gregory stammered. His voice had jumped up a full octave into a sickeningly sweet, desperate register. He clasped his hands together in front of his chest, rubbing his clammy palms nervously as he plastered on a forced, terrified grin. I am so incredibly sorry for the disruption, sir. I was simply disciplining my daughter. She has a terrible habit of acting out and causing scenes in public. Please give me just 2 minutes of your time. Let me explain the Dubai situation and the pension liquidity transfer. It was a completely authorized temporary maneuver to secure future assets for Vanguard. Warren did not even dignify my father with a glance. Warren was a titan of the global shipping industry, a man who navigated billion-dollar freight contracts and ruthless corporate warfare daily. He kept his eyes locked straight ahead, his jaw set in unyielding stone. Warren took 2 decisive, heavy steps forward, moving directly into Gregory's path. Gregory let out a strangled gasp and scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own rented dress shoes to get out of the chief executive officer's way. Warren treated him exactly like a piece of discarded trash blocking the hallway. He walked straight past Gregory and stopped directly in front of me. The 3 massive private security guards fanned out behind him, creating an impenetrable physical barrier between us and the rest of the ballroom. The string quartet in the corner had completely stopped playing. The silence in the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Every single high society wife, every wealthy investor, and every Vanguard executive was staring at our tight circle. Then the CEO of Vanguard Logistics, a man my father had worshipped, feared, and bowed to for his entire professional career, slowly lowered his head to me in a gesture of profound, undeniable respect. The collective gasp from the surrounding crowd of socialites sucked the remaining oxygen right out of the room. I could hear the rustle of expensive silk and the sharp clinking of jewelry as the women who had been openly mocking me moments before instinctively stepped back in horror. Patricia broke the heavy silence. She stepped forward, her face twisted in an ugly, desperate mask of denial. She simply could not allow this narrative to exist. It defied every single rule of the reality she had meticulously constructed and forced me to live in. Warren, what on earth are you doing? Patricia scoffed, her voice shrill and grating against the quiet ballroom. She waved her hand at me with aggressive, frantic dismissal, her cheap red sequins flashing under the chandeliers. You absolutely do not need to be polite to her. She is nobody. She is just a bitter girl trying to cause a scene to humiliate us in front of your colleagues. She has been pulling these vicious little stunts since she deliberately ruined Cameron's Sweet 16 party just to steal the spotlight. She is a complete fraud and a compulsive liar. Do not feed into her delusions. Warren turned his head with glacial slowness. He looked directly at my mother. The expression on his face was not just anger. It was a profound, chilling disgust. He looked at Patricia as if she were a toxic spill ruining the marble floor of his ballroom. He did not raise his voice, but the absolute crushing contempt in his eyes made Patricia physically recoil. She took a stumbling step backward, bumping hard into Beatrice Sterling, who actively shoved her away. You have absolutely no idea what you have done. Warren stated, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried effortlessly through the dead, silent space. And you clearly have no idea who you are addressing. He turned his back on Patricia completely and permanently dismissing her existence. He looked back at me, his posture straightening to full, rigid attention. The room waited suspended in a state of absolute shock. Madam Chairman Warren, said, his voice ringing out with absolute clarity and deference, the internal forensic audit of Vanguard Logistics is complete exactly as you ordered. The financial hemorrhage regarding the Dubai situation has been fully documented and isolated. We are ready to proceed with the termination and prosecution protocols at your command. The blood drained so rapidly from Gregory's face that his skin took on a gray, waxy pallor. His knees visibly buckled, forcing him to grab the edge of a tall cocktail table just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His jaw hung slack. His eyes bulged out of his head, darting wildly between Warren's bowed head and my perfectly calm expression. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out for several agonizing seconds. His mind was violently rejecting the words that had just echoed across the room. When he finally managed to force a single strangled word past his paralyzed vocal cords, it sounded like a dying gasp. Chairman. The single strangled word hung in the air, vibrating with Gregory's complete and utter devastation. Chairman. He stared at me, his eyes darting frantically between my calm expression and Warren's bowed head, desperately searching for a punchline to a joke that did not exist. His mind was violently rejecting the reality unfolding in front of him. Before his shattered brain could even begin to process the magnitude of Warren's absolute submission, a low, urgent murmur rippled from the back of the grand ballroom. The massive gilded double doors swung open with a heavy, resonating thud that instantly commanded the attention of every single billionaire socialite and executive in the room. The string quartet, which had tentatively resumed playing, stopped dead once again. The sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns parted completely down the center, creating a wide, unobstructed path across the marble floor. Through the doors walked Winston Kensington. The patriarch of the Kensington global empire did not simply enter a room. He consumed it. He moved with a slow, measured, and lethal grace, leaning slightly on a silver-tipped cane that clicked sharply against the polished stone with every single step. He projected an aura of crushing old money power that instantly lowered the temperature of the entire ballroom. And walking directly to his right, matching his commanding pace step for step, was Ethan. My husband's dark eyes were flat, merciless, and locked completely onto the pathetic scene unfolding around me. For a fraction of a second, Patricia and Gregory stood frozen in the center of the crowd. Then a deeply flawed, delusional survival instinct kicked in. In their twisted, status-obsessed minds, they saw Winston Kensington not as an executioner, but as a savior. They saw the patriarch of a traditional dynasty, a man they assumed would be utterly appalled by a young wife stepping out of line and causing a corporate scandal. They genuinely believed that if they appealed to the head of the family, he would put me in my place and force Vanguard Logistics to sweep Gregory's massive financial crimes under the rug. Patricia grabbed Gregory's arm, hauling him upright from where he leaned against the high cocktail table. Together, they launched themselves forward physically, shoving their way past Warren and his private security detail. Cameron and DeAndre had wisely faded into the background, retreating toward the exit the moment the security guards appeared, leaving their parents completely isolated in their own spectacular demise. Patricia and Gregory completely abandoned any remaining shred of dignity. Patricia practically sprinted across the open floor, her cheap sequined dress violently scraping against a waiter's silver tray, sending 2 crystal champagne flutes crashing to the ground. She did not even look back to apologize. Gregory trailed right behind her, panting heavily, his face slick with sweat. They intercepted Winston and Ethan near the center of the ballroom, throwing themselves into the patriarch's path, like desperate peasants blocking a royal procession. "Mr. Kensington! Please!" Patricia shrieked, her voice cracking with a frantic, shrill desperation that made several nearby executives physically cringe. "Your nephew's wife is a fraud. She is trying to ruin my husband's career to get back at us for a petty family argument. She is completely out of control." Gregory aggressively nodded along, stepping in front of Patricia to directly address Winston. He swiped a shaking hand across his sweaty forehead, attempting to force a professional smile that looked more like a grimace. "Sir, you have to stop this immediately," Gregory pleaded. "She is using your family's name to intimidate my superiors. She is manipulating Warren into firing me over a temporary accounting error. It is a disgrace to the Kensington reputation. You must rein her in." Winston did not flinch. He did not step back. He did not show a single ounce of surprise at the 2 sweating, screaming people currently blocking his path. He simply stopped walking. He rested both of his impeccably manicured hands on the silver head of his cane and looked down at them. His expression was not angry. It was one of profound, crushing indifference. He looked at my parents the exact same way a person might look at a cluster of insects scurrying across a pristine kitchen floor. He let their desperate, pathetic pleas echo into the dead silence of the ballroom, allowing them to thoroughly, publicly humiliate themselves in front of Manhattan's corporate elite. Winston slowly turned his head to the side, his gaze sliding past my parents to meet Ethan's cold stare. "Are these the relatives you mentioned?" Ethan Winston asked. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that required absolutely no volume to command total authority over the massive room. Ethan did not even blink. He looked down at Patricia and Gregory with absolute, unadulterated disgust. "Yes," Ethan replied, his tone dropping the ambient temperature by another 10 degrees. "Unfortunately." The sheer freezing contempt in Ethan's voice finally stripped away the last of Gregory's delusional hope. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a freight train. He was standing in the Plaza Hotel, completely exposed, having just admitted to a massive financial cover-up in front of his own chief executive officer, and the one man he thought would save him was looking at him like a pest waiting to be exterminated. Gregory's legs gave out. He completely collapsed, dropping heavily to his knees, right there on the polished marble floor. The Vanguard wives gasped in unison, clutching their diamond necklaces in pure horror as they watched a senior executive publicly grovel. Gregory reached out his trembling hands, hovering just inches from the hem of Winston's tailored trousers, too terrified to actually make physical contact. "Sir, please," Gregory begged, his voice dissolving into a pathetic, high-pitched sob. Tears of absolute panic pooled in his eyes and spilled down his red, sweating cheeks. "Discipline her. She is completely out of control. Tell Warren to back off. Please put your daughter-in-law in her place." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and entirely lethal. Winston stood perfectly still, looking down at the weeping, kneeling man at his feet. Then a low, booming chuckle erupted from deep within his chest. It was a dark, terrifying sound that held absolutely no warmth or humor. He tapped the silver tip of his cane once against the marble floor, the sharp crack ringing out like a judge's gavel. "Discipline her." Winston repeated, tasting the words as if they were poison. His voice dripped with a venomous, crushing amusement. You absolute fools. Winston lifted his chin and looked right past the groveling figures of my parents, his sharp eyes locking directly onto mine across the room. I do not give orders to Sydney, Winston stated, his voice echoing with absolute, undeniable finality. He offered me a slow, deeply respectful bow of his head. She gives orders to me. The silence in the Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, breathless quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion. A pin dropping on the marble floor would have sounded like a gunshot. Winston Kensington's words hung over the crowd, completely dismantling decades of my family's deeply ingrained superiority complex. Patricia's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated denial. Her mind forcefully rejected the reality standing right in front of her. She shook her head violently, the cheap sequins of her dress rustling aggressively in the quiet room. That is a lie! Patricia stammered, her voice shrill and desperate as she pointed a manicured finger at Ethan. Ethan is your nephew. He is the Kensington heir. She is just a nobody who manipulated her way into your family. She married him for your money. She is using your assets to fund these corporate stunts. Winston did not raise his voice, but his resonant baritone effortlessly commanded every corner of the vast ballroom. He looked at Patricia with a mixture of pity and crushing disdain. My nephew Ethan is a brilliant man, Winston stated clearly, making certain that every Vanguard executive, every banking official, and every gossiping socialite heard every single syllable. He is a phenomenal executive. But he is merely the chief operating officer. The woman you call a nobody did not marry into my family's wealth. She generates it. Patricia opened her mouth to argue, but Winston cut her off with a sharp rap of his silver-tipped cane against the marble. Sydney built Apex Holdings entirely from the ground up. Winston continued, his voice ringing with profound respect as he turned slightly toward me. I am nothing more than an early minority shareholder who was fortunate enough to recognize a prodigy when I saw one. Sydney is the chief executive officer. She is the founder. She is the majority owner of this entire global conglomerate. She is the phantom buyer who just swallowed Delta Corp whole, and she did it before my own banking analysts even realized the board was in play. The collective gasp from the socialites around us was loud and sharp. Beatrice Sterling, the banking CEO's wife who had mocked me moments earlier, literally swayed on her feet, clutching a nearby cocktail table for physical support. Winston shifted his heavy gaze down to my father. Gregory was still kneeling on the floor, his rented tuxedo soaking up the spilled champagne, his mouth hanging open in a state of catatonic shock. Winston raised his cane and pointed the silver tip directly at Warren, the Vanguard Logistics CEO, who stood rigidly at attention a few feet away. You came to me begging for your miserable career, Gregory Winston said, his tone dripping with lethal amusement. You demanded that I put my boss in her place to save you from a federal fraud investigation. But you are pleading with the wrong Kensington. Winston leaned down slightly, his shadow falling over my father's trembling figure. Exactly 1 month ago, Apex Holdings finalized a quiet, complete acquisition of Vanguard Logistics. Winston revealed, delivering the final crushing blow. The ink dried 3 weeks ago. Warren answers directly to the Apex board. Which means your daughter is not just a guest at this charity gala. She is Warren's boss. She is your boss's boss. You are not begging me for your job, Gregory. You are begging her. Gregory let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He slowly turned his head, looking up at me from his knees. The arrogant patriarch who had spent 30 years demanding absolute submission, who had forced me to scrub diner tables to fund his golden son's lavish lifestyle, was now staring at me with the wide, terrified eyes of a cornered animal. He was completely at my mercy, and he knew exactly how much mercy he had shown me in the past. None. Across the room, movement caught my eye. Cameron and DeAndre had been lingering near the edge of the crowd, desperately hoping the velvet of their dinner jackets would allow them to blend into the shadows. The moment Winston uttered the words, Apex Holdings, the arrogant smirks permanently vanished from their faces. The realization hit them simultaneously. They were standing inside a building owned by the exact woman they had spent their entire lives mocking, abusing, and stealing from. The stolen $2 million from the pension fund was not just a crime against Vanguard Logistics anymore. It was a direct theft from my personal corporate conglomerate. Cameron nudged DeAndre. With synchronized cowardly precision, my brother and his husband began slowly backing away from the crowd. They kept their heads down, attempting a quiet, desperate retreat toward the heavy brass doors of the rear fire exit. They thought they could simply slip out into the Manhattan night and escape the catastrophic fallout of their own greed. They were wrong. I had spent 15 years watching them walk away from the destruction they caused. They were not leaving this room until they paid the tab. I raised my right hand into the air. I snapped my fingers. The sharp, singular sound cracked through the ballroom like a whip. Security! I commanded, my voice cold, carrying absolute authority over the entire Plaza Hotel. Lock the doors. The heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom slammed shut with a deafening, terrifying thud that echoed off the vaulted gold leaf ceilings. The sound was so final, so absolute that it made several executives near the rear of the crowd physically jump. Two massive private security guards, men built like brick walls and dressed in immaculate black suits, stepped smoothly in front of the polished brass handles. They crossed their arms in perfect unison, their faces completely devoid of emotion, creating an impenetrable physical blockade. Cameron and DeAndre slammed to a sudden, frantic halt. Their expensive dress shoes skidded against the marble floor as they nearly collided with the solid wall of muscle standing in their way. Their desperate, quiet retreat was officially over. They were trapped. Cameron spun around, his meticulously styled hair falling out of place, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. The realization that he was locked inside a room controlled entirely by the sister he had spent his life tormenting finally shattered his carefully maintained facade. He completely crumpled. The arrogant, condescending sneer he usually wore melted into a mask of ugly, hysterical terror. "Sydney, please." Cameron sobbed, his voice cracking loudly as he stumbled forward. He threw his hands up in the air, pleading with me across the expanse of the ballroom, completely abandoning any sense of dignity or pride. DeAndre did not mean to lose the money at the blackjack tables. It was an accident. It was just a bad run of luck. We are your family. You cannot do this to us. You have billions of dollars, Sydney. You have an entire global empire. Just pay back the pension fund and let us go. You can easily afford it. Please, I am begging you, just let us walk out of here." A wave of furious whispers erupted from the Vanguard Logistics employees standing in the crowd. Hearing Cameron openly admit to gambling away their retirement savings sent a shockwave of pure rage through the room. The senior vice president's wife, the same woman Gregory had physically shoved moments earlier, let out a sharp gasp of sheer outrage. The wealthy investors and socialites who had come to network and gossip were now completely captivated by the catastrophic implosion of my family. I did not say a word immediately. I simply looked at my older brother, taking in his pathetic, crumbling posture. I took a slow, deliberate step forward. The sharp click of my heels against the polished marble floor rang out in the dead silent room. I took another step, then another. I walked smoothly and calmly across the open floor, leaving my father kneeling in his own sweat and Patricia frozen in her absolute horror. I stopped just a few feet away from Cameron and DeAndre, forcing them to look me directly in the eye. "You called my wedding the little party, Cameron." I stated, my voice dangerously even. The acoustics of the ballroom carried my words perfectly, ensuring every single investor and high society wife heard exactly what kind of man my brother truly was. "You stood in my living room, drank my wine, and told our parents that my life was entirely pathetic because I did not have a real job like you. You laughed in my face. You mocked me for years. You treated me like a disposable servant while you played the wealthy, brilliant visionary. You demanded respect you never earned." Cameron flinched, shrinking back against DeAndre, as if my words were physical blows. He opened his mouth to formulate an excuse, but his throat worked soundlessly. And now I continued, my tone dropping into a lethal freezing register that made the surrounding guests hold their breath. Now you want me to use my billions to cover your husband's casino debts. You want me to quietly bail out the fraudulent shell company you used to steal the retirement savings of the very people standing in this room. You want me to save you from the consequences of your own staggering greed. DeAndre, realizing that Cameron's hysterical weeping was only making them look worse, decided to try a different tactic. He puffed out his chest, attempting to inflate his physical presence and project an authority he absolutely did not possess. He took an aggressive, jerky step toward me, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "You cannot hold us in here!" DeAndre snarled, his voice loud but painfully strained. He glanced nervously at the two security guards blocking the exit before glaring back at me. "This is a hotel, not a prison. What you are doing right now is illegal. That is kidnapping. I know the law, Sydney. I have investor rights. I am a registered partner in a corporate entity. You cannot just lock us in a room and threaten us. Open those doors right now, or I am calling the police and having you arrested." I did not flinch. I did not step back. I simply looked at DeAndre with the exact same crushing indifference Winston Kensington had shown my parents moments before. I let his empty threats hang in the air, allowing the absolute absurdity of his demands to sink into the minds of everyone watching. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a small, sleek black remote control. I held it up, letting the polished plastic catch the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. I turned my body slightly, aiming the remote directly at the massive, dormant presentation screens flanking the main stage at the front of the ballroom. "You do not have investor rights, DeAndre," I said, my voice cutting through his pathetic bluster with absolute surgical precision. "You have an indictment." I pressed the center button on the sleek remote. High above the main stage, the heavy velvet curtains mechanically parted. Two massive high-resolution projector screens silently lowered from the ceiling. A blinding white light flashed across the darkened ballroom, illuminating the horrified, sweat-slicked faces of my family. I did not show the crowd a meticulously crafted corporate marketing presentation. I showed them a financial guillotine. The screens flickered to life, displaying a highly organized, completely undeniable timeline of federal crimes. On the left screen, magnified 10 times its normal size, was the Vanguard Logistics Employee Pension Ledger. A thick red circle highlighted a series of unauthorized wire transfers, totaling exactly $2 million. On the right screen, the destination of those stolen funds was displayed in stark high-definition clarity. It was a banking receipt, confirming the deposit into a Cayman Islands offshore account registered to a fraudulent crypto shell company entirely owned and operated by DeAndre. Then the static banking images shifted to video. Crystal clear security footage from a VIP room at a luxury Dubai casino began playing for the entire room to see. It showed DeAndre dressed in a custom-tailored silk suit, casually tossing stacks of high-denomination chips onto a baccarat table. Cameron was standing right behind him, cheering loudly with a crystal glass of champagne in his hand, completely oblivious to the security cameras capturing them gambling away the retirement funds of the very people standing in this ballroom. A private security guard stepped forward and respectfully handed me a wireless microphone. I accepted it, the cool metal grounding me. I turned to face the sea of shocked Vanguard executives, banking officials, and wealthy investors. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing off the gold leaf ceilings, carrying the absolute, uncompromising weight of a chief executive officer. Vanguard Logistics has always prided itself on operational integrity and trust. Unfortunately, a thorough forensic audit initiated by my firm has uncovered a catastrophic breach of that exact trust. The man kneeling on the floor before you, your former sales director Gregory, actively abused his position of power. He systematically embezzled $2 million directly from the Vanguard Employee Pension Fund. I raised my hand and pointed toward the massive screens playing the casino footage on a relentless loop. He did not steal this money to cover a temporary corporate oversight. I continued, my voice slicing through the dead silence of the room. He wired the retirement savings of the hard-working people in this room directly into a phantom crypto shell company. A company run entirely by this man DeAndre, designed specifically to finance a lavish lifestyle and international gambling debts. A collective horrified gasp ripped through the ballroom. The absolute magnitude of the betrayal hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. Several older investors' men who had been clinking glasses and discussing visionary tech opportunities with DeAndre just 20 minutes earlier suddenly looked physically ill. They backed away from Cameron and DeAndre as if the two men were highly contagious, their faces twisting in pure disgust. The Vanguard wives' women who relied on those exact pension funds for their families' futures began shouting in outrage. The polite veneer of high society completely vanished, replaced by a raw, furious demand for justice. Gregory did not attempt to defend himself. The last remaining shred of his arrogant bravado instantly evaporated under the crushing weight of public exposure. He slumped forward, his forehead pressing directly into the cold marble floor, and began sobbing hysterically into the carpet. His loud, pathetic wails echoed horribly against the silence of the disgusted crowd. He curled into a tight ball, physically trying to hide from the reality of his own destruction. But Patricia was utterly incapable of accepting defeat. Her reality was fracturing, and her response was sheer, violently unhinged denial. Her narcissistic mind simply could not process that she was no longer the untouchable matriarch of a wealthy family. She needed a scapegoat, and she needed one immediately. "Liar!" Patricia screamed. The sound tore from her throat, a guttural shriek of absolute madness that made the surrounding guests flinch. She shoved her way past a terrified Vanguard vice president, her eyes wide and manic, completely ignoring the devastating evidence playing on the massive screens above her. "You are framing them!" Patricia shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure delusional rage. She lunged forward, charging directly toward the stage with her hands outstretched, desperately intending to physically rip the microphone from my grasp and forcefully silence the broadcast of her family's complete ruin. She wanted to twist the narrative back into her favor by sheer force of will. "You are doing this to get back at me," Patricia yelled, her voice breaking as she sprinted across the marble. "You fabricated all of these bank statements just to destroy my husband's career because I refused to attend your pathetic little wedding. You are just a jealous, spiteful girl." She did not make it to the stage. In her blind, frantic rush to attack me, the heel of her expensive shoe caught hard on the heavy, sequined hem of her own gown. Her ankle twisted violently. Patricia let out a sharp cry as she lost her balance entirely, plunging forward in a chaotic tangle of limbs and fabric. She hit the polished marble floor hard, sliding to a humiliating, undignified halt. She landed directly at Ethan's feet. Patricia gasped for air. Her elaborate hairstyle ruined her cheap sequins scraping against the floor. She slowly lifted her head, looking up at my husband, expecting the Kensington heir to show her some shred of pity or assistance. Ethan did not offer her a hand. He did not step back. He simply stood tall, looking down at his mother-in-law with eyes entirely devoid of any human warmth or compassion. He stared at the woman who had tormented his wife for decades, watching her wallow on the floor in her own spectacular demise. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not operate on family drama. Patricia Ethan stated, his voice a flat, devastating finality that officially ended her reign of terror. The harsh reality of Ethan's words had barely registered on Patricia's horrified face when the atmosphere in the grand ballroom shifted entirely. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling arched windows overlooking Grand Army Plaza, a violent explosion of color flooded the room. Alternating flashes of blinding red and blue strobe lights painted the faces of the terrified guests, casting long, erratic shadows across the gold leaf walls. The distant, unmistakable wail of multiple police sirens cut through the Manhattan night, growing louder and more deafening by the second until the vehicles clearly slammed into park right outside the hotel entrance. DeAndre froze. The color instantly drained from his face, leaving him a sickening shade of gray. His eyes darted frantically from the flashing lights in the windows to the two massive security guards blocking the main brass doors. The smug, entitled aura he had worn like a shield his entire life, completely evaporated, replaced by the sheer primal panic of a cornered animal realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. With a guttural shout, DeAndre broke. He abandoned Cameron completely, shoving his own husband hard into a passing waiter to clear a path. DeAndre made a wild, desperate dash toward a side service corridor near the catering kitchens, his expensive loafers slipping dangerously on the polished marble. He knocked over a tray of champagne flutes, sending shattered crystal flying across the floor as he scrambled for an escape route that did not exist. He did not make it more than 20 feet. Warren, the Vanguard Logistics CEO, whose company had just been saved by my acquisition, stepped smoothly into the aisle. Without altering his calm expression, Warren casually thrust his heavy leather dress shoe directly into DeAndre's path. DeAndre's shin caught Warren's foot at full sprinting speed. He went entirely airborne. His arms flailed uselessly as he crashed face first into a heavy cocktail table, collapsing the metal frame and sending them both plunging to the hard floor in a heap of tangled limbs and spilled ice. The crowd erupted into shouts, parting widely to leave DeAndre groveling alone on the wet marble. He scrambled onto his back, his custom suit soaked and torn, his chest heaving as he stared up at the disgusted faces of the wealthy investors he had spent the evening trying to impress. It was a high-risk venture, DeAndre screamed, his voice cracking with desperate, pathetic hysteria. He scrambled backward like a crab, pointing a shaking finger toward the massive projector screens still displaying his casino footage. You all know how this industry works. Startups lose money every single day. The market shifted. It was an aggressive portfolio strategy. It is not a crime to fail. The silence that followed his outburst was absolute and completely merciless. The Vanguard executives, the men and women whose retirements he had callously flushed away at a baccarat table, stared at him with a silent, burning hatred that required no words. I stepped slowly to the very edge of the stage, the microphone gripped firmly in my right hand. With my left hand, I reached into the sleek leather briefcase Winston Kensington's assistant had silently placed on the podium moments earlier. I pulled out a heavy, incredibly thick manila folder, the edges bound tightly with red evidence tape. You are entirely correct, DeAndre, I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings, cold and sharp as cracked ice. It is not a crime to fail. I held the heavy dossier high in the air, letting the flashing red and blue lights from the windows reflect off the stark white evidence labels. But forging Securities and Exchange Commission filings to create a phantom corporate entity is a crime, I stated, dropping each word like a stone block. Funneling stolen employee pension funds through international shell companies to bypass federal banking regulations is a crime. Committing wire fraud across international borders to fuel your gambling addiction in Dubai is a massive, undeniable federal offense. DeAndre let out a whimper, pulling his knees to his chest. Across the room, Gregory let out another loud, wet sob, burying his face deeper into the carpet as the full reality of his complicity washed over him. Cameron simply stood paralyzed, staring blankly at the wall, his mind completely broken by the sheer velocity of their downfall. You all thought I was just the quiet, disposable daughter. I continued, my gaze sweeping over my trembling father on the floor, past my catatonic brother, and finally landing on Patricia, who was still slumped at Ethan's feet. You thought you could treat me like garbage, demand my submission, and discard me whenever I became inconvenient. You thought you were untouchable. I lowered the folder slightly, looking directly into my mother's wide, terrified eyes. Do you remember my wedding day, Patricia? I asked, my voice dropping into a deadly quiet register that commanded the absolute attention of every soul in the ballroom. Do you remember the exact moment you decided my life was not worth celebrating? You sent me a text message from a luxury spa. You told me my wedding was a joke. You told me I was an embarrassment, and you demanded that I sort myself out before I ruined the family name. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She just stared at me, trembling violently. I took your advice, Mother, I said, a razor-sharp smile curving my lips. I sorted myself out. I handed this exact dossier containing every single piece of evidence regarding Gregory and DeAndre's international wire fraud directly to the authorities the exact minute your text message came through. I spent my entire wedding reception securing the final warrants. Before Patricia could even process the magnitude of her own fatal mistake, the heavy brass doors at the back of the grand ballroom were violently pushed open from the outside. My private security guards immediately stepped aside, clearing the path. A heavily armed team of federal agents in stark navy blue windbreakers, the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their chests, marched into the room. Their heavy tactical boots thudded against the marble in absolute synchronization. The sharp, metallic rattle of steel handcuffs clinking at their belts cut through the dead silence of the terrified crowd. They moved with undeniable lethal purpose, parting the sea of wealthy socialites and executives like Moses parting the Red Sea. They did not pause. They did not hesitate. They marched straight past the ice sculptures and the champagne towers, making a direct line for the center of the room. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a deeply lined face, stopped exactly halfway between the stage and the open doors. He did not look at the crowd. He looked directly at the two men cowering on the floor. Gregory Adams and DeAndre Vance, the agent, barked, his voice carrying the full, uncompromising authority of the federal government. "You are under arrest." Two federal agents broke away from the entry formation, their heavy tactical boots crunching loudly over the shards of broken crystal littering the floor. They reached Gregory first. My father did not fight. He did not even look up. When the agents grabbed his upper arms and hauled him up from the carpet, he hung between them like a discarded marionette. His rented tuxedo jacket was bunched awkwardly around his shoulders, stained with spilled alcohol and his own cold sweat. He looked incredibly small, incredibly frail. The sharp, distinctive ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed with absolute finality. The powerful, terrifying patriarch who had dictated my entire existence, who had demanded absolute perfection while harboring a rotting, corrupt core, was completely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified old man facing federal prison. DeAndre, however, chose a completely different path. The moment a federal agent reached down to haul him up from his pathetic sprawl on the marble floor, he completely lost his mind. He violently jerked his arm away, kicking out wildly. "Get your hands off me!" DeAndre shrieked, his voice cracking into a hysterical pitch as he thrashed against the polished floor. "You do not know who you are dealing with. I am a partner at a venture capital firm. You cannot touch me. This is a corporate misunderstanding." He spat a vile string of profanities, screaming insults at the agents, at the crowd, and finally at me. He clawed at the legs of a nearby banquet table, desperately trying to anchor himself, bringing a heavy silver centerpiece crashing down onto his own shoulder. It was a spectacular, humiliating public meltdown. The stoic federal agents were entirely unfazed by his temper tantrum. With practiced clinical efficiency, two agents pinned his shoulders to the floor, twisted his arms sharply behind his back, and secured the handcuffs. They dragged him roughly to his feet. His expensive silk suit now completely ruined his face, purple with rage and exertion. Cameron stood completely frozen, watching his husband being manhandled like a common street criminal. He did not step forward to defend him. He did not utter a single word of protest. The cowardice that had defined my brother his entire life kept his feet glued to the floor, terrified that if he moved, the agents would put him in steel brackets next. The collective shock of the arrests seemed to finally break whatever fragile tether Patricia still had to reality. Seeing her husband in handcuffs and her golden son's husband being forcibly dragged toward the exit entirely short-circuited her mind. The illusion of her flawless superior life was dead. She was no longer a wealthy society matron. She was the wife of an embezzler. With a sound that was half sob and half scream, Patricia scrambled forward. She literally abandoned her pride, crawling on her hands and knees across the cold marble. She dragged herself through the sticky puddles of spilled champagne and the scattered debris of the broken cocktail tables. She crawled directly toward me. Her hands, adorned with expensive diamond rings funded by my father's stolen money, shot out and grasped frantically at the hem of my designer gown. She clutched the fabric with a desperate, white-knuckled grip, her face turning upward. Her immaculate makeup was completely destroyed. mascara running in dark, ugly streaks down her cheeks, her carefully set hair hanging in damp, pathetic clumps. "Sydney, my baby." Patricia wailed, her voice a shrill, agonizing plea that made several nearby executives physically turn their heads away in secondhand embarrassment. "Please, Sydney, you have so much power. Tell them it is a misunderstanding." She yanked on the hem of my dress, practically prostrating herself at my feet. The woman who had spent 30 years looking down her nose at me was now begging in the dirt. "You can write a check right now and cover the pension fund." She sobbed, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a frantic, hyperventilating rush. "Just pay the money back. They do not have to go to prison. I will do anything. I will be a real mother to you. I am so sorry about the wedding." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of her bargain hung in the air. She was actually trying to purchase her husband's freedom by offering me the maternal affection she had maliciously withheld my entire life. She was using the title of mother as a bargaining chip to avoid the catastrophic destruction of her social standing. I did not kick her away. I did not step back in disgust. I simply stood completely still, letting her clutch the fabric of my dress, letting every single person in that grand ballroom witness the absolute depths of her pathetic, groveling desperation. I looked down at her tear-streaked, ruined face. I let the silence stretch out, letting her false promises of love ring hollow in the heavy air. Slowly, deliberately, I leaned down. I ignored the gasping crowd. I ignored the federal agents reading Gregory his Miranda rights. I bent at the waist until my face was merely inches from her trembling, frantic eyes. The scent of her expensive perfume was sour with the smell of pure panic. "I already covered the pension fund, Mom," I whispered softly, ensuring my voice was low enough that only she could hear the absolute zero temperature of my words. "Because I take care of my employees." Patricia's eyes widened in sudden, desperate hope, completely misunderstanding my meaning. A trembling, pathetic smile began to form on her lips. She thought her groveling had worked. "But I will never ever cover for you." The heavy brass doors of the Plaza Hotel swung shut with a resounding metallic thud, permanently cutting off the frantic, pathetic shouts of DeAndre and the hollow, broken weeping of my father. The flashing red and blue lights that had violently painted the ballroom walls finally ceased, leaving the gold leaf and crystal chandeliers to cast a warm, steady glow over a room that had been fundamentally and permanently altered. The federal agents were gone. My family was gone. The silence that washed over the grand ballroom was absolute. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a hostage situation, but the stunned, breathless awe of witnessing a Category 5 hurricane tear through a building and leave a single person standing untouched in its epicenter. Hundreds of New York's most powerful executives, banking officials, and wealthy socialites stood entirely frozen. No one moved. No one dared to speak. They simply stared at the stage. I stood alone at the edge of the platform. The wireless microphone in my right hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. I slowly lowered it to my side, my fingers trembling just slightly, as the massive surge of adrenaline began to recede from my bloodstream. For 15 years, I had built my empire in the shadows, fighting tooth and nail to secure my independence while carrying the crushing, toxic weight of my family's constant emotional abuse. I had spent decades swallowing their insults, their condescension, and their blatant favoritism. Now the execution was complete. The poison had been completely excised from my life. But with the victory came a sudden, profound exhaustion. It settled deep into my bones, a heavy, aching fatigue that made my shoulders slump a fraction of an inch. The war was over, and the battlefield was completely silent. The shattered crystal from DeAndre's desperate escape attempt littered the marble floor, catching the light like crushed ice. The crowd parted slightly as a single figure stepped forward. Warren, the CEO of Vanguard Logistics, moved with a slow, deliberate, and highly measured pace. The arrogant executive who had allowed Gregory to manipulate his way up the corporate ladder now looked incredibly pale. His expensive tailored suit seemed a size too large for his shaking frame. He carefully navigated around the spilled champagne, his eyes fixed firmly on the ground until he reached the base of the stage. When Warren finally looked up at me, there was no trace of his former corporate superiority. There was only absolute terrifying respect. He recognized exactly who held the power to destroy him, and he knew how narrowly he had escaped the federal indictment that had just swallowed my father whole. Madam Chairman Warren began, his voice raspy and completely devoid of ego. He bowed his head deeply, a gesture of complete submission in front of his own employees and peers. I apologize for letting that rot fester in my division. It will never happen again. The title rang out clearly in the silent ballroom. Madam Chairman. Hearing the man who used to command my father now pledge his absolute loyalty to me was a surreal, intensely vindicating moment. I did not soften my expression. I did not offer him a warm, forgiving smile to ease his anxiety. I maintained the cold, authoritative posture of a woman who controlled billions in global assets. Clean house. Warren. I commanded, my voice projecting crisp and clear without the microphone. I want every single executive who looked the other way thoroughly investigated. I want full transparency on the pension fund restoration delivered to my desk tomorrow morning. Warren swallowed hard and nodded quickly. Yes, Madam Chairman. Consider it done. He stepped backward, melting into the crowd of Vanguard employees who were now looking at me not as a scandalous family outcast, but as their absolute savior. From the corner of my eye, I caught a shift in movement. Ethan was ascending the short carpeted staircase to the stage. He moved with the quiet, effortless grace of a man entirely comfortable in his own skin. He did not rush, and he did not say a single word. He simply walked across the polished wood floor until he was standing directly behind me. I felt the sudden, comforting weight of his tailored tuxedo jacket being draped gently over my bare shoulders. The silk lining was still warm from his body heat. Ethan slid his strong arms around my waist, pulling my back flush against his solid chest. He rested his chin softly on the top of my head, becoming a silent, immovable fortress of protection against the staring crowd. His steady heartbeat thumped against my spine, grounding me. The cold chill of the adrenaline crash vanished, replaced by the deep, resonant warmth of a partner who had stood unwavering by my side while I dismantled my abusers piece by piece. I leaned back into his embrace, closing my eyes for just a fraction of a second, drawing immense strength from his presence. Down on the main floor, the sharp, elegant clinking of a silver cane against the marble shattered the lingering tension. Winston Kensington stood tall and immaculate amidst the sea of stunned guests. His dark eyes glittered with profound pride and lethal amusement. He reached out and smoothly plucked a fresh glass of champagne from a passing terrified waiter. Winston raised the crystal flute high into the air, holding it directly toward the stage. He turned his heavy, commanding gaze to the surrounding socialites, the silent executives, and finally back to me. To the most ruthless, brilliant woman in the room, Winston declared, his baritone voice carrying a tremendous, undeniable finality. For a heartbeat, the room remained entirely still. Then Beatrice Sterling, the banking CEO's wife, who had openly mocked my dress just an hour ago, hurriedly raised her own glass, her hands shaking as she tried to align herself with the new power dynamic. Within seconds, the entire grand ballroom followed suit. The applause started as a scattered, hesitant clapping from the Vanguard employees before rapidly erupting into a deafening, thunderous roar. Hundreds of New York's absolute elite clapped and cheered, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceilings and washing over the stage in massive waves. They were not just applauding a successful corporate acquisition. They were applauding a total, masterful conquest. I stood on the stage, wrapped in my husband's jacket, listening to the roar of the crowd. I looked at the empty spot on the carpet where my father had groveled in his own sweat and where my mother had desperately begged for a bailout. They were finally gone. I leaned my full weight back into Ethan's chest, wrapping my hands tightly around his arms. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and finally allowed myself to exhale. 3 months dissolved the Addams family empire into absolute nothingness. The swift, brutal efficiency of the federal justice system did not care about high society pedigree or country club memberships. When the heavy wooden gavel slammed down in the United States District Court, it sounded the official death knell for Gregory and DeAndre. There were no backroom deals or suspended sentences. The Vanguard Logistics paper trail was entirely bulletproof, and the Dubai casino footage played just as devastatingly for the federal judge as it had in the Plaza Ballroom. DeAndre Vance, stripped of his custom-tailored silk suits and arrogant swagger, wept openly as he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud and embezzlement. Gregory Adams, the man who had demanded absolute perfection and submission from everyone around him, was handed 10 years. When the bailiffs ordered them to turn around and place their hands behind their backs, Gregory looked completely hollowed out, a frail, trembling ghost of a patriarch shuffling off to a concrete cell. The financial implosion hit with terrifying speed. The federal government seized every liquid asset, every investment portfolio, and every offshore account to immediately restore the Vanguard Employee Pension Fund. The massive suburban estate, the physical monument to my father's supposed superiority, was swiftly foreclosed upon by the bank. Patricia watched the repo men carry away her antique furniture, her imported rugs, and her crystal chandeliers. She had desperately dialed the numbers of every single wealthy socialite she had spent decades courting. She called Beatrice Sterling. She called the Vanguard wives. Every single call went straight to voicemail. Her entire social circle, the women she had prioritized over her own daughter, excised her from their ranks overnight. She was a pariah, a highly contagious social disease. Patricia now resided in a claustrophobic, dimly lit one-bedroom apartment on the gritty outskirts of the city. The paint on the walls was a sickly peeling yellow. The air smelled permanently of stale cooking oil and damp carpet. Patricia sat on a cheap second-hand sofa wearing a faded bathrobe. She stared blankly at a small, muted television screen, her hands resting limply in her lap. The sprawling galas, the catered dinners, the absolute power she once wielded, were gone. She was entirely alone, trapped in a suffocating silence, surrounded by the physical reality of her catastrophic choices. She had thrown away the one child capable of saving her to protect a facade that collapsed the moment it was tested. But the most spectacular plunge from grace belonged to Cameron. The undisputed golden child, the son who had never worked a single hour of hard labor, who had spent his adult life coasting on DeAndre's fraudulent wealth and our parents' blind favoritism, was suddenly forced to survive in the real world. With his husband incarcerated and his parents destitute, the endless stream of cash completely dried up. His luxury vehicles were repossessed. His platinum credit cards were canceled. Under the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of a discount supermarket, Cameron Adams stood at checkout lane 4. He wore a stiff, scratchy polyester uniform shirt that was 2 sizes too big, the bright red fabric a glaring neon sign of his spectacular fall from grace. His hands, previously accustomed only to holding crystal champagne flutes and designer luggage, were now chapped and raw from handling damp produce in frozen cardboard boxes. He shoved a stack of canned beans into a cheap plastic bag. His movements were clumsy and slow. An impatient customer tapped her foot, loudly glaring at him. Cameron flinched, his face burning with a deep, consuming humiliation. He accidentally dropped a jar of generic tomato sauce. It hit the linoleum floor with a heavy thud, rolling under the conveyor belt. "Hey, Adams, pick up the pace!" the shift manager barked over the intercom, his voice dripping with annoyance. "We have a line forming. Stop daydreaming and bag the groceries." Cameron swallowed hard, his jaw trembling. He bent down, scraping his knees against the dirty floor to retrieve the dropped jar. He had spent his entire life looking down his nose at people who worked service jobs, treating them like invisible background characters in the movie of his glamorous life. Now he was the background character trapped in a cycle of minimum wage labor just to afford instant noodles and bus fare. The protective bubble of his golden child status had popped, dropping him directly onto the unforgiving concrete. At the end of his grueling 10-hour shift, Cameron clocked out. He pushed through the sliding glass doors of the supermarket and stepped out into a freezing torrential downpour. He did not have a car waiting. He did not have an umbrella. He stood under the sickly yellow glow of a flickering street lamp in the flooded parking lot, the freezing rain instantly soaking through his cheap polyester uniform. He reached into his pocket with trembling rain-slicked fingers. He pulled out a bulky, prepaid burner phone. His top-tier smartphone had been disconnected weeks ago when the bill bounced. Cameron stood in the freezing rain, his teeth chattering. He stared at the glowing screen. Desperation raw and absolute gnawed at his stomach. He had nowhere else to turn. His friends had abandoned him. His husband was gone. His mother was catatonic. He dialed the only number left in his memory, the number of the sister he had mocked, belittled, and actively tried to destroy. He was ready to throw away every last shred of his pride. He was ready to beg for a handout, a job, a place to sleep. He pressed the phone to his freezing ear, holding his breath as the line connected. There was no ringtone. A sharp metallic beep sounded, followed instantly by the cold, mechanized voice of an automated operator. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." Cameron froze. The automated message repeated on a relentless loop, a digital confirmation of his total, uncompromising isolation. Sydney had not just walked away from the family. She had completely erased them from her universe. She was unreachable, untouchable, and entirely gone. Cameron stared blankly ahead as the rain battered his face. His hand went completely slack. The cheap plastic burner phone slipped from his numb fingers. It fell through the air and splashed directly into a deep, muddy puddle at his feet, sinking instantly beneath the murky water. High above, the relentless, pulsing energy of Manhattan sunlight poured through the immaculate floor to ceiling glass walls of my corner office at Apex Holdings. The morning sky was a brilliant, cloudless expanse of sapphire blue. It was a perfect, pristine morning, serving as a stark and poetic contrast to the dark, stormy night that had officially finalized my family's spectacular ruin exactly 3 months prior. I stood perfectly still near the expansive window, letting the genuine warmth of the sun wash over my skin. The view stretched out for miles, a sprawling, concrete jungle of ambition and power. I no longer looked at the city from the outside in. I stood at its very apex. The heavy, suffocating weight of the Addams family name, a burden I had carried like a lead weight around my neck for 3 decades, was completely irreversibly gone. The gentle, muted click of the heavy, frosted glass door opening broke the quiet solitude of the room. Ethan stepped into my office carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee from the artisanal cafe down the street. He looked effortlessly sharp in a tailored charcoal suit, his presence radiating the same steady, unwavering calm that had anchored me during the absolute worst moments of my life. He did not ask for permission to enter my sanctuary. He belonged here, right by my side, an equal partner in every sense of the word. Ethan crossed the vast expanse of the room, his footsteps silent on the thick carpet. He handed me one of the cups, the cardboard sleeve warm against my palm, and leaned in to press a soft, lingering kiss to my cheek. "Warren just sent over the quarterly financial report," Ethan said, a deeply satisfied, razor-sharp smile playing on his lips. "Vanguard Logistics is officially up 30% since the acquisition. It turns out that forcibly clearing out the deeply entrenched dead weight and completely restructuring the executive board does absolute wonders for the profit margins." I smiled, a genuine, relaxed expression that reached all the way to my eyes. I looked down at the bustling city streets far below, thinking about the sheer efficiency of the takeover. "Clean house, Warren," I murmured, recalling the exact order I had given the terrified CEO 3 months ago in the center of the Plaza ballroom. "He took the directive quite literally." Ethan chuckled, taking a sip of his own coffee. "The federal indictment certainly helped expedite the termination process. The entire corporate culture has shifted overnight." I took a slow sip of the rich, dark roast, letting the bitter warmth ground me entirely in the present moment. I turned my gaze back out over the sprawling city, reflecting on the sheer magnitude of the empire I had quietly, meticulously conquered, while everyone else in my life was busy looking the other way. My mind drifted back through the decades, traversing the painful, winding road that had led me to this glass tower. I thought about the incredibly frightened, painfully quiet girl who used to hide in her small bedroom while her parents threw lavish, catered parties downstairs to celebrate every minor manufactured achievement of her arrogant brother. I thought about the young woman who had been systematically mocked, entirely belittled and consistently dismissed as a useless, ungrateful disappointment. For far too long, I had allowed their constant cruelty to dictate my internal worth. I had internalized their venom, believing that my quiet nature and my desire for authentic connection were somehow fatal character flaws. While Cameron bagged generic groceries in a damp, scratchy polyester uniform, and Patricia withered away in a cramped, silent apartment, entirely isolated from the high society she craved, I was standing exactly where I had earned the right to be. Their destruction was not an act of malicious vengeance on my part. It was simply the inescapable consequence of their own profound greed and boundless arrogance. They had built their entire existence on a foundation of lies, stolen money, and artificial superiority. I simply removed the rug from beneath their feet and let gravity do the rest. I had spent years believing the deeply ingrained lie that blood mandated absolute loyalty. Society and tradition had taught me that shared DNA somehow obligated me to silently endure their endless emotional abuse, their blatant financial manipulation, and their relentless psychological warfare. But loyalty is a two-way street, and respect is a currency that must be entirely earned, never simply demanded by birthright. My parents had demanded my absolute submission while actively funding my destruction. They had expected me to cheerfully finance my own humiliation. I refused to play the role of the compliant victim any longer. I had ripped the pen directly from my mother's manicured hand and written my own devastating ending to their toxic narrative. I excised the cancer from my life with surgical precision. I was no longer the forgotten, invisible daughter cowering in the shadows of the golden child. I was the undisputed architect of my own destiny, a woman who had forged a massive, untouchable empire out of the very scraps they had carelessly tossed aside. The crushing, crippling anxiety that used to paralyze me at family dinners had been completely replaced by the cold, hard steel of absolute self-reliance and the warm, genuine love of a chosen family who actually valued my existence. I turned fully back to face the breathtaking panoramic view of the skyline, taking another slow, savoring sip of my coffee. The silence in my office was not lonely or isolating. It was the beautiful, resonant sound of absolute freedom. Family isn't the people who systematically belittle your hard-won achievements just to artificially inflate their own fragile egos. When they call your life a little party, do not argue with them. Just buy the building lock, the brass doors, and let them pay the devastating tab. Have you ever had to cut toxic people out of your life to finally breathe? Let me know in the comments. The conclusion of Sydney's journey offers a profound lesson on self-worth and the true meaning of family. For years, she endured the toxic weight of her blood relatives, internalizing their relentless abuse and blinding favoritism. However, her ultimate victory proves that shared DNA does not obligate us to accept mistreatment. True power is born from radical self-reliance and the courage to sever ties with those who actively diminish our light. She successfully rebuilt her destiny from the scraps they discarded, proving respect is earned. Have you ever had to cut toxic people out to finally breathe? Let me know below.